Are you guys ready to go?
I think so. I am abandoning efforts to complete my rewording of Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire" for use this week. But, boy, is there a lot of stuff that could go into it.
Can you drop those lyrics into the chat?
I decidedly can. I've got about 13 of the 16 lines I need for the first verse, but they need some work.
We can't sum it all up. The backlog's always growing thanks to that Chris Bowen. We can't sum it all up. If we didn't list it, we might have missed it.
Rod Sims, Garno, Superpower Roadshow, Chalmers, Roundtable, Home Efficiency Label, Sovereign Bonds Go Green, ASIC Watches Claim Scene, Clean Taxonomy, Net Zero Modelling, Kitchen Sink, Everything, Big Build, Wind and Sun, Can 3 terawatts be done? EV plan, utes and vans, won't consider ice bans. That's as far as I've gone.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. It's a pleasure to be with you from Gadigal country.
And an accomplished lyricist specialising in energy and climate parody songs, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
I don't have a deep back catalogue, but maybe a bright future.
On this week's show, we look at the IEYay's 2023 country report on Australia, hot off the presses and brimming with ideas for how we can sharpen up our policies on energy efficiency, renewables and R&D. But first, this week the federal government released its long-awaited electric vehicle strategy, which confirmed the government's commitment to a fuel efficiency standard and fired the starter's gun on a rapid-fire 6-week consultation process that the responsible minister, Catherine King, says could result in legislation by the end of the year. Frankie, this is obviously welcome, but the strategy has been criticised by some as a bit light on detail. What did you make of it?
Well, I mean, I think your opener there really stole the show in terms of what's new in this strategy.
Sorry.
How dare you steal my thunder?
But the thunder can keep reverberating.
Come on, I'm sure you can elaborate on my one-sentence summary. Is that really all there is in this EV strategy?
No, I mean, it's a pretty fair assessment, though, that a lot of the initiatives announced in this have been foreshadowed or have had some commitment attributed to them for quite some time. I think the really significant development is the prospect of our first fuel efficiency standard for light vehicles. And as you say, there's a separate consultation paper that's been launched out of that. I think interesting to note that they've pitched it in terms of where the efficiency standards might land, like rather ambitiously. And I think, there's perhaps a desire to set it in line with other advanced economies like the EU and the US, and then potentially have to work backwards from that. So that is incredibly significant. That'll be borne out when we start talking about the IEYay's assessment, because that's really the part of the transport sector that requires a lot of work and is responsible for an enormous amount of emissions. But the other things that are really, interesting that are new are around a recycling and sort of reuse and stewardship initiative for EV batteries, which is going to be necessary into the future. So that's very welcome. There's also a few initiatives committed to in terms of the rollout of the systems and infrastructure to enable EV uptake, particularly around charging infrastructure. And they note very explicitly the need to look at what can be done for residents of existing apartment buildings, because there's challenges there around integrating charging infrastructure in some of those high-rise buildings. So that's really good to see. And then beyond that, there like as we say, there's sort of restated objectives around both supply, provision of infrastructure and demand, but a lot of those initiatives were already known and sort of out there.
Well, Tennant, I'm conscious that the fuel efficiency standard bit of this is probably the part of the IEYay's country review that they could have just fired up the photocopier and reprinted from previous country reviews.
Yes.
This has been on the to-do list for some time, but I'm also conscious that it rolls off the tongue, but there's probably listeners that aren't quite sure exactly what an efficiency standard is. Do you want to unpack it for us?
So this approach is not about forcing any one particular car to reach this or that target. It's about what's called in the US and other places corporate average fuel economy, or of all the new cars and light commercial vehicles added to the fleet each year, what is the overall performance of them against a standard? And it might be more than one standard. You might wind up with a standard for cars and a standard for light trucks. That's the way that it works in many places. But when you set a standard like this and you ramp it up every year, and you provide some warning for companies that have got to comply, so the importers of vehicles, the suppliers of vehicles, not like dealerships or anything like that, then you also give them some flexibility potentially in how they meet the standard, most simply through, if they overperform in one year, maybe they can bank that to help meet the increasing target the following year, that kind of thing. More controversially, there might be bonus credits for selling cars with particular innovative technologies like hydrogen fuel cells. Or at one point, it was proposed that in a several steps back in the long and so far entirely unproductive saga of Australian debate about fuel efficiency standards, it was proposed that there be multipliers for those exotic little seen on these shores battery electric vehicles. But that's probably not going to be a part of it now, because that increasingly looks like it will be just your bog standard average car before too very much longer. Should you have multipliers for, or not multipliers, but credits for reducing other things about a car other than its fuel efficiency that contribute to emissions, like the refrigerants that it uses in the air conditioning system? There's going to be a lot of detail for people to get across and get some thoughts into the government on by the end of May. And then the government's intention is to finalise the standard by the end of this year. And maybe, it's unclear, maybe bring it in the next couple of years. And if they do, it all depends, what difference it makes all depends on how tough the standard is. If we are converging to one or another of the international major economy examples, and how fast we might converge with them.
And I guess the thing to bear in mind about this is that whatever happens, it's a slow burn because it impacts the new cars that are hitting the market, right? The great tragedy of inaction in this space, and there's been various sort of politicians that have stuck their head up and said, well, this is a good idea, and for various reasons have gotten shot down over the last decade and beyond. The fact that we haven't acted on this means that there's all of those vehicles that are now on the road in people's garages right around the country, and there's an expectation, and a fair one, that those Australian families are going to get the years that they expected out of them. Average registered
Vehicle, light vehicle, is 11 going on 12 years old. That's a lot of inertia.
Yeah.
For whatever the change in the mix of new vehicles is, unless something else changes about the rate of turnover, that's a long-term impact. And equally, so if we're going to try and make a contribution to the 2030 targets, or even really the 2035 targets, the standard has to be pretty aggressive from pretty early on to make much difference a decade out.
And should we put there role in context in terms of the broader emissions challenge. I think transport emissions, in total are something like 19%, I think, of our emissions, and over half of that, I think, is associated with those passenger vehicles and light commercial vehicles. So they're really, about 10% or more chunk of emissions that aren't going to be moving as quickly as we might like.
I would just add that the electric vehicle strategy, Mark 1, is very much a light transport strategy.
Yeah.
It doesn't have anything much to offer yet on road freight. And that's going to be an increasingly important area to get moving on. I think we are all constantly passing up opportunities for really bad transport metaphors, but hitting the accelerator on road freight emissions reduction and investments.
Yeah, we shouldn't present this as the transport sector's strategy. In total, there are a lot of other forms of transport that aren't captured by this. You talked about heavy transport. That's before you get into anything around aviation or shipping or heavy rail and the like, even though that makes up a smaller proportion. But there's, other significant challenges in different parts of the transport sector that deserve attention as well.
All right. Shall we chat about a report?
We shall.
It's hard not to chat about this one because anything you can say is likely to be in this report.
Last week, the International Energy Agency released its 2023 country report on Australia, an in-depth energy policy review encompassing conventional energy systems, energy system transformation and energy security. There is a lot going on in this 200-page report, but today we are zeroing in on Part 2, Energy System Transformation, which includes 4 chapters. The first of these chapters covers the overarching energy sector response to climate change. The second focuses on energy efficiency. The third on renewable energy, and the fourth on energy innovation. There is a lot here, Tennant. What did you make of it?
So, reading this report was a little bit like back when we read the Australian government's first national climate change statement, in that it's a kitchen sink report. They are throwing everything into the paper to say these are all the relevant things that are being done in Australia, and there's a lot of things, but there is also quite a bit of interest here, I think, even for people familiar or reasonably familiar with what's going on. Actually, there's quite a few things that you probably didn't have at the top of your mind, and being reminded of them. And, there's some good things. There's some things that are a bit of a mess of confusion and too many things happening. So that reminder function is quite useful. And for many people, it won't be a reminder. It'll be, here's the first time that you're seeing the breadth of what's going on. Also, I think the perspective from an international set of assessors is interesting. I don't think it's always easy to be somebody from the outside trying to make sense of what's happening in a complex jurisdiction, but it can be quite informative to see what does come across to that perspective. And also get all these comparisons of how Australia is performing on various metrics versus overseas. And then the third thing that I think is interesting, and we'll get into some of this some more, is the in some cases explicit recommendations or judgments, in other cases kind of reading between the lines, notable silences or points that are almost made and then just shied gently away from. There's a lot of close reading of parts of this document for some of the major questions and controversies in Australian climate and energy policy and politics. The IEA isn't always making itself easy to be cited, but they're saying some relevant things.
I think it's useful to reflect on the IEA's position, right? It's a membership association. Australia is a member of the IEA, and so this is, I think, in many places, a fair account of past and current policy. The premise of this review is to identify gaps and areas where one could do things better, but there is also a tightrope that the IEA necessarily needs to walk, in which that if it went around doing takedowns of its member countries' energy and climate policies, probably wouldn't have that many members after a while.
Yeah.
Although you could imagine the sliding doors moment where maybe the federal election result in 2022 had been different, in which case I think there would have been potentially quite a few more negative things to say.
Yeah.
Because one of the other sort of features of this report, it is what it is because these things take a while to pull together, and I imagine, like big ships, are hard to turn around. Oh, I'm sticking with our transport metaphors tonight. They note a number of policy reviews that are in motion, and some of those have finished now, and I suspect it was just too late for them to include an assessment of those. Like, for example, the review of the safeguard mechanism and the the Chubb review of ACCUs, as well as things like the EV strategy that, to be fair to them, launched on the same day as this report.
Hold the presses, IEA. But then they'd never get it out at all.
Indeed. In terms of, the point you made there about, because they do this several times through the document when they make some commentary about things that could happen, ought to happen, but then aren't necessarily reflected in a concrete recommendation. I don't know if you both clocked this one towards the front of the report, which was talking, so this was more the upfront summary and kind of key recommendations. Might have been in the executive summary, where they talked about how we've ratcheted up our international commitments. We've updated our NDC, our nationally determined contribution, to 43% by 2030, but that we also signed the global methane pledge to cut methane emissions by 30% on 2020 levels by 2030. And they sort of note that, globally, a lot of signatories to that pledge are developing action plans with actions and targets to reduce methane emissions from fossil fuel operations. But then this report doesn't really go to making much suggestion about what Australia might do in that regard.
Yeah, there were a few of those where it's not like, we're not telling you to do this, Australia, but let's just take a break from reviewing Australia and go and have a look at what these other countries are doing. Our minds are just wandering to Denmark, who has a strong annual review process for their energy and climate policies, or Canada, who has put in place sectoral emissions reduction targets and an explicit cap on the oil and gas sector. Could be relevant, might not be relevant. Who's to say?
But it's odd because they then are rather explicit and very specific about some of their other recommendations that you would, compared to something like that, is much more in the minutiae of the details within, say, the energy sector's transition.
And that sort of energy sector responses to climate change, I thought was really useful as a pretty up-to-date account of, where our emissions are coming from. And one of the things that really stood out to me was just a reminder of how emissions intensive our economy, and particularly our electricity system, remains relative to comparative countries. You sort of get into this space of the ramp up of renewables is happening so rapidly that it feels like we're doing well relative to our global competitors, but we're coming off such an incredibly dirty electricity system that we've still got a long way to go.
Yeah, to a point where we were the most emissions intensive of electricity sectors of any of the countries considered in the IEA. I don't know if that's true of the world, but of our peer economies, still super emissions intensive. On a whole of economy basis, we are about nearly double the IEA average emissions intensity per unit of economic output. And per capita, not quite double, but substantially above. So you're right, a long way to go. Although I also thought the economic intensity, the emissions per unit of GDP numbers, also to me really highlighted. I mean, the IEA is arguing for, well, they're not quite explicit about this, but they're quite keen on reducing emissions intensity of GDP and decoupling growth from GDP. Some people out there think there just needs to be less GDP, that degrowth is an answer. And these sorts of emissions intensity numbers really highlight just how expensive or ineffectual, I think, just generic reduction in economic output as a means of trying to reduce emissions is.
Yeah.
It essentially means you're talking about at 0.3 kilos of CO2 per US dollar of economic output. Just reducing GDP to reduce emissions would cost about $3,000 US of GDP per tonne of emissions reduced, which is pretty bad. You don't need to be the PC to say, oh, we can do better than that.
That's true. You know, the other kind of way they split the data that's always really interesting to see from an external body is where they talked about the fact that our emissions rose a lot from our export-oriented sectors, so our coal, LNG and others, compared to our domestic-focused sectors. I think, what was the fact I took out? I was like, since 2005, we've reduced our emissions by 41% from our domestic-facing sectors, but those with exporting-facing sectors have risen by 47%. You're basically cancelling those things out.
Yeah, there was a similar dynamic in the industrial sector where they talked about actually the manufacturing sector's been doing a pretty good job in terms of reducing its carbon intensity.
I had a question about that number.
Well, I had a question for you, which was what's going on? Because I was surprised to see that manufacturing intensity was going down. But the point they were making is that it was effectively flat because the emissions intensity of manufacturing was going down, but the emissions intensity of mining was going up. So I was going to throw to our resident industry expert, Tennant from the AI group, and then, what's going on with that?
Okay, well, I've got two thoughts about that. One is that there absolutely has been across industry a lot of energy efficiency improvement over the past couple of decades for very unsurprising reasons that are recounted at places in the paper. But adoption of LED lighting has improved a lot of things. Higher efficiency motors have improved a lot of things. But I think that a lot of this improvement is actually to do, well, what shows up as an improvement against a stat that is the economic value of total manufacturing sector output and compared with total emissions from the manufacturing sector. So you get an intensity figure. I think that has been heavily affected by changes in the composition of manufacturing rather than the performance of individual facilities. In particular, we lost a couple of aluminium smelters, which are humongously energy intensive. We lost a steel blast furnace. We lost a few other highly energy intensive facilities, while overall manufacturing output by value increased, involving a lot of food processing and machinery and equipment and a lot of other things that are not super energy intensive. So I think that is probably the biggest thing there, which is a bit of a, I don't know, you could look at that and say, oh, that's a perfectly fine story. Economy pivoting to make stuff that's lower energy intensity is perfectly fine. You could otherwise look at it and say, oh, that's a bit disappointing because we want to get better at doing the things like we still need aluminium and steel and cement and lots of other things. it would be great if we could get radically better at making those things as well.
Yep.
And maybe we will, but so far it's been incremental improvement, I think.
Yeah. So the thing that I was most interested in this chapter was some of the colour commentary on the nascent frameworks that the new government has started to put in place and had started to put in place by the time of writing the Climate Change Act, the annual statement, the legislating a 43% target for 2030 and the net zero target by 2050. Lots of ticks from the IEYay on all that, but they're all already reflecting on some of the ways that those frameworks can be strengthened. There's a strong call for interim economy-wide targets for emissions reduction between now and 2030 and indeed beyond to 2050, sectoral targets for emissions reduction. So we've got a bit of a sense of the size of the task in each sector of the economy. We've had some conversations about that before on the podcast and how it's a bit tough to, frame up policy for commercial buildings or residential or indeed the industrial sector if you don't have a really clear understanding of what you're trying to achieve in that particular sector. And, even looking at some of the various levers one has to pull in energy sector decarbonisation and say, well, how much of this is going to be achieved by renewables? How much is going to be achieved by energy efficiency and electrification and other technologies? And so there's a sense in which they're saying, well, you've got a good framework here, let's keep fleshing it out, and indeed learning from other places around the world that have had a little bit more time to think through how they can put that sort of infrastructure in place.
Really timely to have that articulated in this report, given they do note the government's commitment to keep doing those annual statements to Parliament. Like, they frame that up as the key mechanism through which progress is being assessed and sort of can be judged more broadly to be being effective or not, as well as I think the commitment that was made in the first statement that Minister Bowen made last year to develop this economy-wide net zero strategy that ostensibly is going to speak to the contribution from all the different sectors. So I think it's laying some really useful markers on the role of targets on a sectoral basis, not just on the longer term horizon on 2050, but shorter term on 2030, 2035 and things like that. The other thing, and I know I'm maybe the one that harps on about this on the pod, maybe I'm the resident resilience nerd, but they also did highlight the importance, of resilience to Australia, in particular, noting that our temperature is rising a bit more quickly than the world average, and that we are, as a country, more exposed to extreme heat, for example, and that has pretty significant implications for the energy sector broadly in Australia, not just from a demand side perspective, because that means, higher cooling loads in people's homes and buildings to keep people comfortable through those hot days, but also just how our infrastructure stands up to high temperatures over time. And they note that we've not really done the comprehensive assessment, of those impacts on the energy sector. So they're making what's a very sensible case to do that work and to then step out a bit of a plan for an adaptation strategy for the energy sector, both from a demand and a supply side perspective.
The point was really well made, and the extra thing I'd add on to it is that it underlines what a crucial piece of energy infrastructure the thermal performance of residential buildings is. Because it's the coincidence of stress on our power system, our generation and network infrastructure, and that increase in air conditioning load on those very, very hot days that causes massive issues. It already has in certain instances. The report references blackouts we've had in very recent history. So to the degree that we can improve thermal performance, reduce that cooling load, as well as doing all the other things that we should sensibly do to improve the resilience of the power system itself, that could be an incredibly efficient way of building much more resilience into our energy system.
Yeah, and as we know, they do set out a number of recommendations that go to that very point further on in the energy efficiency chapter as well, which had me, and I'm sure all of us, very excited.
Shall we talk about the energy efficiency chapter?
It's too big to ignore. Or is it? Previous Australian governments to the contrary.
Oh, Tennant, don't activate my PTSD. So this is a very substantive chapter. I think that it is fair to say that the International Energy Agency, in all of their work, is very interested in the role of energy efficiency. I don't think coined the term first fuel, but they certainly are champions of it and were trying to insert it into the lexicon very early, the idea that this is just an absolutely crucial lever that we have to pull through the energy transition. What was your reaction to the kind of the framing of this chapter, which was pointing to past successes in terms of energy efficiency improvement, I think, as a way of underlining how much more opportunity there could be in the future with strong policy settings?
Yeah, they said that Australia has saved an average of 235 petajoules a year over 2000 to 2020, or nearly more than 4,700 PJs in total from industry and services and housing and efficiency across the board. And they also say, and we're way off track to the targets that we've already set and would need to ramp up much faster to get there, and even more so to be consistent with a net zero trajectory. But you're right, they ease us in by saying, oh, you've done something. Like, well done, little country.
They say you've done something, but it kind of fell off a cliff in 2015, right?
Yeah.
So, we were doing very well between 2010 and 2015, increasing our energy productivity, which is the metric they use for the most part throughout this chapter, by 2.7% a year. And then we sort of hit a wall, and the average between 2015 and 2020 was 1.9%. This is one of the points where I felt like they were making some veiled commentary on the previous government. Maybe,
but they did also say that the global average in that time was similarly quite low as well.
Yeah, it's pretty low, yeah.
Around 1.6%. So I agree with you. You could read it a couple of different ways. But then there's no doubt that they're saying, well, one, they characterise the existing target that we've got in this space, which is, a bit old now. This relates to the National Energy Productivity Target and the plan associated with it, which was a 40% improvement by 2030.
Off 2015 levels.
Yeah, that's right. And that's not going to be sufficient or in line with a net zero trajectory that they've mapped. But something in the order of 53% would be closer. I think they say a 57% improvement to 2030 would be consistent with their net zero pathways, and then that implies ramping up pretty considerably from our perhaps slower pace of energy performance improvement up to 4.2% a year. So, which is astonishingly higher than anything we've done in the last 20 years.
Well, it's probably important to say where that all comes from. So I was pleased to see the NEP get one last run around the track. No one's been talking about it very much lately. Not even the previous government towards the end of their term was talking about it very much. And certainly I haven't heard the new government throwing that target around. So, but I guess no one said it's not the target anymore. So I guess it's the target.
Yep, until something else replaces it.
But then that's important context, right? Because in the absence of another sort of more ambitious target, which one would expect is coming as part of the forthcoming National Energy Performance Strategy, what has the IEYay got to benchmark us against? They've got their net zero trajectory in the report that they released in 2021, and it's a kind of a global assessment of what we would need to do, and it's an average improvement of 4.2% a year between 2020 and 2030, which gets you up into as you say, towards 60% improvement over the course of those 10 years. I think that's a useful threshold or a useful benchmark for us to reflect on as the government is putting together that strategy, but it is a generalised sort of assessment of what's going on around the world. And, maybe that would be quite challenging given that we're already in 2023. Maybe we need to be more ambitious because we've got a lot of opportunity because not that much has been happening recently. I think that's something that we'll need to assess given the particular circumstances we find ourselves in, right?
So the NEP is not only getting one last run around the track, but then being let off the track, not to go to the Macquarie, but to go to an exclusive clinic run by the IEYay to be heavily injected with steroids in the form of a lot of policy recommendations. Like, I think they had the most intense recommendations in this chapter of all of the chapters that we looked at. What were they calling for?
Oh, lots of things. I mean, I was very excited about what they had to say about the building sector.
So, just to clarify, Frankie, did you ghostwrite this section of the IEYay report, or?
I could have, because I was going through the recommendations against the policy roadmap I'm due to launch in a week's time. Spoiler alert, more on that later. And I was going tick, tick, tick. So that was very satisfying.
Global Vice President of IEYay ventriloquism.
Indeed. But also I think there have been some pretty well established policy frameworks in place in the building sector for some time. So for an international body coming in to make an assessment, by and large, it's all laid out. And I did appreciate that there was, in terms of where they saw the opportunity more broadly across energy efficiency, they highlight in particular residential buildings as well as the transport sector for those parts of the economy where the most improvement or productivity potential exists. And so in the commentary, they do acknowledge that there has been a historic difference in the way that policy's been developed and then actioned in residential buildings versus commercial buildings, which have had, much more success at improving energy efficiency over the last 20 years in particular. So when it comes to the commentary and the recommendations that they make, well, they make a point of talking about the potential of residential buildings. There's 10.85 million dwellings in Australia, and most of those are individual houses, and about 13% townhouses, 16% apartments. That's due to change and ramp up to be more apartments over time. In terms of then the recommendations, well, we've got increasing the minimum standards in the National Construction Code, and having a more sort of forward-looking pathway over that, building on what's already in this trajectory for low-energy buildings that's been agreed for a couple of years. It talks about expanding the coverage of successful schemes like Neighbours in the commercial building sector and the Commercial Building Disclosure Program, which obliges people who are buying or leasing office space over 1,000 square metres to disclose their neighbour's energy rating. It's a wildly successful, world-leading program, and it says that should be expanded to more building types. And really significantly, it says that the residential sector needs to follow suit. And we need to start seeing mandatory disclosure of the performance of homes at the point of sale or lease, which is something that my organisation, my day job, and many of us, especially you, Luke, as well, have supported for some time. could keep going on, but there's a call for a national retrofit strategy. So we need to renovate Australia. We want to see targets and incentives put in place, and look to the experience overseas for large scale programs, how that could be done. More labelling on not just on buildings, but on the appliances that we're talking about. Need to see further uptake, as well as looking at minimum performance requirements, particularly when it comes to rental properties. So loads to unpack. That's just a quick fire tour through it, but all things, a lot of the industry's been talking about for a long time. There's really widespread support for those things, and I think there's sort of high hopes that these will all be features of the National Energy Performance Strategy that's currently in development.
I reckon it's a reflection of the relative sophistication of the conversation in Australia around this policy area. Because for the IEA coming in, they can talk to a whole bunch of people, get a really good understanding on the ground, and get a really clear idea of what's going to work. There's plenty of reports, plenty of research, plenty of thinking that's gone into buildings in particular. The trajectory for low energy buildings has provided a vehicle over some years now for state and federal governments to come together around this policy agenda. And so, they can say with some confidence, this is the roadmap. And it's heartening to see that reflected and endorsed, but it's almost all that work being reflected back to us, which is in stark contrast to the commentary on industry, which I thought was a little bit depressing, because the section on energy efficiency policies in the industry sector has 3 paragraphs. There's some references to minimum energy performance standards for electric motors and chillers and the like. There's a $60 million program for energy efficiency grants for SMEs, which, while welcome, is not exactly changing the world. And the third program, which actually references the organisation that I work for, is the most embarrassing of all, because scrabbling around at the bottom of the barrel of the Australian Industrial Energy Efficiency Policy, they found the EEC's quick reference guide to energy auditing, which is a fantastic document, but is a 4-page brochure.
Oh dear.
Which is, the fact that made the cut for references to Australian national and industrial policy says quite a lot. I'm not criticising the brochure. It's a fantastic brochure. But, yes, it is, I think, a sad indictment on the lack of policy in this space over the last number of years, Tennant. Yeah,
that mention did stick out to me too. And the recommendations are in this space are a bit light on as far as industry is concerned. Raising awareness and capability, and continuing policy and funding efforts to encourage industry and medium-sized users to identify and implement measures. It's a lot less muscular than what they're talking about for households, and there's a lot to be done. I would say that for the very large energy users, the safeguard mechanism, which is discussed elsewhere a bit in this report, is a very relevant thing. That's an additional push for efficiency, and the switch in fuels, which is also considered elsewhere in this report, is a very, very relevant thing for industry. But you're right. The industry energy efficiency piece of this was a bit underdone.
This is one of the areas where you perhaps need to read between the lines a little bit, because in the commentary at the end of the chapter, they talk about how good ENGAs are, and it's requiring folk to already report on their energy use. And they make the point that, quote unquote, identifying and implementing energy efficiency measures would be a small step based on the ENGAs program. And they make a subsequent point in the next paragraph around how there hasn't really been an industrial policy for energy efficiency since the Energy Efficiency Opportunities Program ceased in 2014. So you can kind of squint. It's like one of those sort of magic eye pictures that I stood in malls when I was a teenager looking at while wearing my hypercolour T-shirt, no doubt, and kind of saw the unicorn appear out of the poster. Yeah. 3D unicorn. There's stuff in there, but it's not very explicit.
You know what I found a little bit funny about this chapter was that, well, a little bit like my comment about them talking about us having joined up to the methane pledge, there's not really any commentary beyond like the fact that energy efficiency is good and we should be doing it, and here are the sectors that need more work. It doesn't really go into bespoke measures for electricity versus gas efficiency. Like it doesn't go there really at all, to your point, Tennant, about fuel switching and things like that. I sort of expected that when you start reading the commentary about where some of the energy is highest in some of these sectors. You know, like natural gas is a big chunk of, for example, household energy use. So it would have been a reasonable thing for them to go down that path with a little bit more to say. But then also in terms of the policy, you know, so schemes we've got in place in Australia, it doesn't, like, it sort of notes that ACCUs are notionally a thing for energy efficiency, but they've never had any take-up. It doesn't trot out all the very well-known reasons why there hasn't been much take-up of that. And they don't have huge amounts to say about energy efficiency schemes, Luke, either, which is interesting. So I thought that was a little bit of a blind spot in this.
They mentioned them on the way through, but I think that this goes to Tennant's comment earlier around how challenging it is to come in and kind of get your head around all the intricacies of a nation's policy regime. I just don't honestly think that they had the ability to get down on the ground level and understand what was going on in every state of Australia. I think it would be, there would be some state governments would say, well, you know, we actually have had pretty sophisticated industrial energy efficiency programs over the journey, and they're not here, they're not represented. But I think that's just the reality of these exercises. It's a bit of a collage of what they were able to gather up rather than absolutely comprehensive account of all the policies that are in place. Hey, I don't want to overdo the energy efficiency because there are other things to get to, but I suppose just to round this one out, this chapter also spoke to the specific architecture around energy efficiency coordination, acknowledged that challenge of coordinating between the state and the federal government and the different levers that different jurisdictions have. And so I suppose that's something that's going to be really important to think about in the context of the National Energy Performance Strategy, but also they pick up that point around fuel efficiency standards and how crucial they are in the transport sector, and that's really the key policy that they champion in the context of transport efficiency in this chapter. So
we should talk about renewables.
We should talk about renewables. The IEYay, pretty positive. This was one of the areas where they gave Australia a tick in terms of the deployment task, Tennant.
That's right. They note we've done a lot to grow our renewables share. They run through a bit of the history of that, including the time when we shrunk the renewables target and then beat the shrunken target. But they note that while we've done well so far in integrating quite high levels of renewables, we've got some accelerating challenges in that regard coming up because we're going to be integrating a lot of renewables. And they highlight that there's no one big policy that's driving or governing that future deployment. There's a bunch of procurement or of contracting arrangements from different governments. There's the capacity investment scheme that the feds and the states agreed in principle recently. And so they're really talking about two things, I think, in terms of action for Australia to take forward. One, to boost the level of coordination of schemes, and they're very keen on the the National Energy Transition Partnership, which is a very positive thing, but it's such an embryonic thing that I'm not sure it can yet bear the weight of positivity that the IEA wants to put on it. And two, they want us to consider further measures to encourage a broader portfolio of renewable energy, and they have in mind offshore wind, which is targeted by the Victorian government, but does not yet have a clear scheme to boost it. They're interested in energy storage and dispatchable renewables. And maybe controversially for some, they highlight in a few different places through this report the value of either doing or considering a scheme for or an expansion of the RET to renewable energy gases and maybe renewable industrial heat in addition. So like a hydrogen RET or a biogas RET.
And specifically blending, right?
And they're very open to the idea of blending. They don't have anywhere that I could see an explicit consideration of blending versus electrification versus whatever else in different contexts. But yep, they note in a seemingly favourable way that there's a number of blending experiments going on.
And the context for that really is like, they talk about the wild success that we've had through the operation of the large-scale renewable energy target in bringing on new utility-scale solar and wind over the last decade in particular. And now that we've kind of met that target, there aren't new incentives on the table for these more nascent industries coming online. So things like offshore wind, like government's not going to be buying LGCs for that because they've already met their commitments. You can still be generating certificates, but it won't be for the purposes of meeting a legislated target. So I thought that was also interesting that they didn't wade into the commentary that others have engaged in, most recently the Productivity Commission, suggesting that the electricity sector or the energy sector needs to be brought into some of these broader-based mechanisms to guarantee that emissions reduction that's forecast over the next decade. They don't really go there here. They're more talking about support for new stuff coming online.
Elsewhere, they do note that we don't have any carbon pricing in the electricity sector, and they note very favourably the expansion of the national energy objectives to include an emissions element. But yeah, they don't take the next step. But I sort of read into that they were hoping that putting emissions into the NEO would sort of lead by hook or by crook to consideration of a carbon price or a carbon value in a crunchier way in the electricity system. But you're right, they don't go explicitly there.
Yeah.
My big takeout from this chapter was the emphasis they put on the system integration challenge. And they particularly call out rooftop solar and the amount of rooftop solar that is anticipated to be added, and that is something that will need to be managed in the context of distribution networks. We're going to have a much smarter grid. We're going to have to think about how we align loads with that renewable resource, to make sure there's efficient investment in storage and networks and generation and all of that. So it was interesting, again, going to your point, Tennant, around the external view looking in, and the strong sense I've got is the IEA is going, great, you're beta testing the 21st century energy system. Let us know how you go with that.
Yeah, we'll be watching at a safe distance.
Well, they also note a couple of those pinch points as well on the way through around the social license question of building out so much new generation and transmission infrastructure. So they talk about the role of the various ombudsmen in this place and really emphasise their role. I think they note optimistically how much the time frames for new projects have come down over the next decade. But then when you're looking at that forward pipeline and how significant it is, that's a lot of big stuff to be rolling out. So they definitely note that.
And even the reduced time frame numbers they're very long. Like,
yeah,
wow, it takes a long time to get something built.
Absolutely. And the other thing they note is around that having secure supply chains to deliver all of these things. So they I think, highlight the fact that we are a resource-rich country and actually particularly rich in some of the rare earth metals and minerals that are going to be necessary for this transition. So I think they're appropriately calling out we need to be harnessing that and having a plan for, for how we're at the forefront of that industry as well.
All right, 3 chapters down, 1 to go. Energy, R&D. Frankie, what did you think?
Yikes.
Pretty simple.
It's kind of all over the place.
What a shit show.
Oh, where to start? I mean, maybe we could put some numbers out there. So I think we've been spending the equivalent of $310 million US dollars in 2021, and that's sort of down on, I think, a peak kind of earlier in the 2010s. So it had been much higher, and that our average or the R&D sort of spend as a share of GDP is 0.02%. GDP, and that's much lower than the IEYay's membership average. I think it's less than half that. So we're not doing great in terms of our peer set. And then, my goodness, a lot of the commentary is just a scattergun listicle of all the things that we're engaged in.
But to be clear, that's not the IEYay's fault. That's because it is just a mess. It's a total mess.
Oh, 100%. I had to read this section a couple of times to even know exactly what to come out of it with. But I mean, there's one kind of clear takeaway, which is that the balance, or quite a bit of the majority of our investment as a country, is more around that commercialization end of the spectrum, rather than that much more early nascent R&D investment and the sort of demonstration end of things. We're very much more heavy on sort of getting it up and out at scale. But also, the thing that I kind of learnt through this is that there's a pretty significant chunk of that $309 million in US dollars that's allocated to fossil fuels, like 34% of it.
The largest single chunk.
The largest chunk of it, 25% to hydrogen, and noting that that's been increasing significantly in the last couple of years in particular. Then cross-cutting technologies comes in next, around 11%. Renewables at 10% only. Energy efficiency the same. And a couple of other things. So they were some of the key takeouts from this, other than your point, Luke, which is it really just is a shambles. It's all over the place.
Well, look, we're spending bugger all on this critical issue. And going to my earlier point, we're at the bleeding edge of the challenge of running a high-penetration renewable energy system. We're spending almost nothing on that early-stage R&D that might help us to do that. Responsibility for this area is speared across departments and the Australian Research Council and ARENA and CSIRO and Oz Industry and CRCs, and there's no plan. Yeah. Just everyone's making stuff up. And, doing their best, no doubt. There's obviously good stuff happening, but there's no strategic view of what all that effort is trying to achieve, Tennant.
Yeah, there's a fairly devastating paragraph that I have a feeling was drafted quite early in the evolution of this report, maybe has been hanging around in drafts for a while. that says the government made energy technology and innovation a key plank for meeting the country's climate goals and for the country's industrial and economic opportunities, but has not provided the funding or the strategy to reach these export markets. To date, there is no strategy or coherent national approach across the government for energy RD&D needed in Australia for the domestic market and its domestic energy transition. And you can read that and go, oh, there's the IEA having a bit of a go at maybe the former government. But that is where we are at now.
Yep.
It doesn't matter who did it or didn't do stuff. That's where we're at, and it's a pretty mediocre place to be. Yikes.
Yikes.
Yeah.
In an absolutely critical area. I was heartened by their account of this Australian Energy Transition Research Plan, which I hadn't come across before. I don't know if either of you have been aware of this work.
And the Council of Learned Academies.
Indeed. And it seems that they have taken it upon themselves to create a bit of a strategy in exile. In the absence of anyone else making a coherent plan, they've been beavering away at this energy transition research plan according to the IEA, and I haven't had an opportunity to dig into the documents themselves. This plan says, look, we're generally pretty good on technology. We just need to ramp up in that space. We're not doing enough on the social science of the energy transition and how we bring people along for the journey and that sort of people-focused policy as we transform our economy. And they recommend a research agenda based on 3 themes. Energy system dynamics, which includes transition pathways, technology and systems integration. The second theme is transition dynamics, which is policy, social license and communication. And the previous chapter on renewables really underlined how crucial that is. And then social engagement dynamics, that's the governance and the risks and the industry jobs lens. That all seemed pretty sensible. I'll be taking a close look at some of that work. But yes, it is a pretty sad indictment that for a coherent policy one has to go to the Australian Council of Learned Academies and pull something off a website as the IEA.
Yeah. In a sense, are we really surprised by this? I'm not, to be honest, because if you think about where the debate, a lot of the policy focus has been in climate and the energy transition over the last decade, we've been really stuck in a fight over the energy sector transition in particular, and even subsets of that have been really monstering all of the bandwidth in this discussion. And every good policy platform that you read produced by different sectors highlights the importance of R&D and workforce development and skills and training, but it's always tempting to look at those things as a bit of an afterthought or just something that is a feature of every plan that you'll see out there. But, there hasn't been, I think, really strong champions for taking, a much more kind of considered and integrated approach to this. So, clearly the time is now to start, probably take a step back and look at where are some of those big opportunities for Australia, for our domestic industries, for exports. Those 3 themes sound pretty good as a starting point that you were talking about, Luke. But I'm not particularly surprised at the state of where it is. I do think, though, it's a really useful call to government to have quite a strategic focus on it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of reasons to do it, right? So they talk about you said the word export. So we are sort of creating this new way of running an energy system. There's the opportunity to create technology and skills and expertise and software and all of those different parts of the puzzle and plausibly export it to the world. But it requires a strategic focus for that to happen. It's not just going to happen by itself. That needs to be an explicit strategy. But then they also talk about technologies that we've talked about on the pod recently, like carbon dioxide removal. It would behoove us to be starting to really think about the role that they play. They talk about the reality that RD&D, the last D is demonstration, and for hard-to-abate sectors, we need to be demonstrating that technology by 2030 to have any hope of it sort of being deployed at a scale that's going to be meaningful by the 2040s and indeed by 2050. So this, I think, out of all of the areas that we look in this report, the new government's been, I think, systematically working through all of these areas that required attention when they hit the government benches. I hate to say it, but I think this is another big agenda that will require some attention, and that the IEYay has done as a service by really shining a spotlight. Perhaps not surprising, Frankie, but it's a rock that I hadn't looked under recently, and I was a bit scared by what I found when I did.
Yeah, but as you say, and I think, this government has been working through the list of commitments it made in the lead up to the election. This wasn't a strong area of focus in that, but it's going to be incredibly necessary to do this strategically, because so much of what's required in the R&D space underpins efforts across sectors, cross-cutting strategies. It all does need to be looked at in quite an integrated way. So the platform is sort of clearly that a more economy-wide net zero strategy that we know we're working towards. So, hopefully this is a bit of a call to have a really strong focus on it.
There was one extra thing in this report that I just wanted to give a quick mention to. It's in the other bits of the report that we weren't explicitly covering, but I had a sneaky peek at what they were saying there too, because the IEA gets invoked quite a lot in arguments in Australia about our fossil exports.
Yep.
It gets invoked by one set of people associated with export to say there's heaps of demand and there's going to keep being lots of demand and we need to keep exporting. And it gets invoked by a lot of other people to say IEA says there can be no new coal or gas development, or we're inconsistent with a pathway to net zero by 2050. And, what do they say in this report? And they're pretty mealy-mouthed about it, I've got to say. They say, with respect to coal, global emissions from use of coal have to peak and decrease dramatically by 2030, but they don't say what that means for Australia explicitly. And on gas, they say the golden age of gas will end by 2030, and there's a very limited window to scale up LNG exports over the next few years, which is something that they talk about the need for more LNG globally to fill the hole left by Russia. But they say golden age ending by 2030, and investment in existing mature fields is compatible with net zero by 2050. And implicitly, therefore, investment in new fields is not, but they don't quite say that. And the outlook will differ in every country, or the meaning of this outlook will differ in every country. So that they don't want to be at the centre of that domestic red-hot political debate. But I think they're going to stay there. Sorry, IEA.
So, Tennant, is it IEYay or IENay?
Overall, I think that they're giving us points for being back in the game.
Yep.
But not a definitive assessment yet.
It'll be fascinating, noting that these things come around every 5 years. The last one was in 2018. The next one will be in, I guess, 2028.
We can look forward to it.
Ooh, how many pods will we have done by then?
How many more Safeguard episodes?
How many more oblique references or explicit references to CBAMs will we have done by then?
As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
I have a bit of shameless self-dealing and self-promotion.
Don't worry, I'll have some of that later.
Well, by the time this pod hits our dear summer uppers earwaves, and this is me in my day job capacity, the Property Council, together with the Green Building Council of Australia, will have launched our joint policy platform called Every Building Counts. It's our roadmap towards zero carbon ready and resilient buildings in Australia, and it's the second time we've produced this policy roadmap. We did it first in 2019, and so we're updating it, and we've got some new things to say in it. So we're not only calling for, the sectoral plan that we need for the built environment to reduce its emissions, we're also saying we need a plan for adaptation and resilience, as well as a just transition and a real need to focus on jobs and market capacity as well. But there are some other spicy things in there too. So electrification and embodied carbon are two themes that are new from the first time that we did this. And in the electrification theme that we're putting out there, we're sort of putting the ambition in line with other jurisdictions and saying that all new buildings should be all electric from the next revision of the National Construction Code in 2025. So that's in line with, quite a few other jurisdictions that have moved off the back of the global energy crisis. And we're saying there ought to be a plan for the phase out of the sale of gas appliances and the use of gas in existing buildings. So, it's not going to happen if you don't plan for it. And that there's a huge retrofitting challenge to do that, as well as all the fabulous energy efficiency we want to see happen across the sector. So 8 policy themes, a smorgasbord of recommendations for the Australian government. Very excited to have Jenny McAllister, the Assistant Minister for Climate and Energy, do that launch with us. And looking forward to seeing how that's received. We've got a lot of things to say about the efficiency of homes as well. And great to see that also supported this week with the Treasurer's Investment Roundtable on Energy explicitly calling out the need for a national energy performance rating scheme for the country, which could underpin mandatory disclosure. So very exciting times in the building space.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to join the Treasurer and Minister Bowen and Assistant Minister McAllister for the roundtable in Brisbane on Friday. And, this is a standing group of bank and super industry chairs and CEOs and other finance sector leaders that are working very closely with the new government, thinking about how private capital can be put to work to address the many and various challenges facing our nation. And it was really striking, the level of sophistication from those finance sector leaders in the room. They are thinking deeply about residential energy performance, about the emissions profile of their mortgage book. For them, that represents Scope 3 emissions, which financial regulators are expecting them to report on and have a plan for over the coming years. And so they're really looking to government to say, well, how do we measure this? How do we track this? How do we support our customers to do things like electrify, to do things like improve their energy performance, to reduce the emissions intensity of their homes over time? It is fascinating how these various agendas, things that you and I have been working on for years, Frankie, are coming together with the imperatives of banks and other finance institutions from a very different perspective, but great to be finding common cause with them on what is a really crucial agenda.
Yeah, and we welcome them all. We love friends of energy efficiency. particularly in the building space. And I think that's right. And, when you start to think about the banks now taking a much closer look at their emissions profiles and the extent to which their exposure through their mortgage books is really biased towards homes in Australia. It means that the performance of Australia's homes and the emissions associated with it is a really significant chunk of their Scope 3 emissions. Hence, great to have their interest and support for these initiatives, which is great to see. Warms my heart.
All right. Well, no doubt there'll be a link to Every Building Counts 2.0 in the show notes.
Or, we tried to get it named but got it shut down, was Make Every Building Great Again.
My personal non-name for your report was Every Building Counts to Count Harder.
Yeah, that's it. So many title options on the cutting room floor.
Tennant, what have you got?
Okay, so I'm going to highlight a flurry of activity coming out of the United States Environment Protection Agency. We've all been talking a lot over the past, getting on towards a year, about the US Inflation Reduction Act, the hurricane of carrots coming at every clean technology you could throw a carrot
That's
at.
very painful.
That's quite a visual.
Getting stabbed in the eyes by these carrots.
Well, look, a hurricane of carrots could turn into like a carrot puree.
Right.
But US policy is not only carrots, and the EPA is bringing 3 sticks to the fight to achieve the US's challenging 2030 emissions reduction targets. They have proposed or are about to propose 3 rules that will help to make that real. One of them is a further ramping up and extension of the fuel efficiency standards, the CAFE standards that apply in the United States, taking them through to the early 2030s, and they don't mandate specific levels of take-up of electric vehicles, but the EPA estimates that the emission standards they plan to set would lead to about 2/3 of US new car sales being electric vehicles by the early 2030s. So very, very dramatic increase in EV penetration expected there. They're also proposing a regulation of the greenhouse gas emissions from existing power plants. So the IRA has got tax credits for new power plants. This rule is going to be saying existing plants have got to meet declining emissions standards for each facility, and if they don't, I guess they're going to close down. Now, they have options to meet that standard. They're only options inside their fence line. The Obama-era EPA proposed a much more flexible rule that would have basically allowed something like an emissions trading scheme to be a form of compliance and give much more flexibility to reduce compliance costs for individual facilities. And a bunch of people, particularly Republican attorneys general, complained about this regulation because of the costs of complying with it. And in particular, they wanted to strike out that beyond the fence line stuff. And they succeeded. It was struck out. And so this new rule is more expensive to comply with because it's lacking that flexibility. So good job. Well done. And then the third rule is about cracking down on methane leaks from the oil and gas sector. So these rules, they're going to be litigated. They're going to be contested. They're being rushed out now for a mandatory comment period so that they can be bedded down before enough time elapses so that the next president, whoever that is, if it happened not to be the second term of Joe Biden, the next president would be stuck with that rule and the next Congress would be stuck with that rule. unless they went through a similarly lengthy and litigated process to reverse it. So we'll see how that goes, but it's looking quite plausible that the US has some pretty hefty sticks to complement its hundreds of billions of carrots.
I'm just trying to remember the details of this, but I thought I saw in my feed at some point in the last 12 months that the Supreme Court had limited the EPA's ability to regulate emissions from generators.
Yeah, they did. No, you're right. They did limit that authority. So in particular, they said you couldn't require them to do stuff outside their own premises.
Right.
So that is the source of this inside the fence line. Like the New York Times was reporting this rule, saying these power stations could install carbon capture and storage to comply with the rule, and maybe they will, given the tax credits for that. But most likely, like they're going to be competing. Coal-fired power stations with CCS, even with a tax credit, are going to be competing against an upsurge in renewables. I don't. The CCS will be an important thing in the total transition of the United States, but it's probably not going to be a big deal, even with this rule and the subsidies in the power sector.
All right. Well, you might have thought that Frankie's one more thing was self-serving, but I've got two shameless plugs for you today. The first is to point our listeners to a big new flagship report my organisation has just launched called Clean Energy, Clean Demand. There have been calls for us to do this on the podcast, but I've had to alert various interlocutors on social media that we have a strict self-dealing rule, and if I've beaten back Tennant's demands that we do his CBAM paper for coming on a year.
I hasten to defend my integrity. I happily accepted the self-dealing rule and have abided by it.
Anyway.
Whereas you are talking about a report even now. Shocked and amazed I am.
Point being, we've released this new report that we're very proud of, Clean Energy, Clean Demand, which is how we integrate renewables, electrification and energy management to transition away from gas, to ensure we're shaping new electric loads to match with the availability of renewables, and of course harnessing energy efficiency to minimise those pinch points at the start of the end and the end of the day, because if we do that, it lowers the total system costs of transition and has the potential, if we get it right, to save billions and billions of dollars on investment in networks and generation and storage. There is a lot in this report. It is, more than anything else, an attempt to break down the silos in the conversation we tend to have around supply and demand, not just in Australia but around the world. But we're absolutely focused on trying to join up that conversation in Australia, because we're getting to the point in the transition where it's absolutely crucial we grapple with some of this stuff. So if you're interested in that link will be in the show notes. And the other one more thing is that we have not yet got around on this podcast to doing ClimateWorks' latest big report, the Australian Energy Industry Transitions Initiative final report, which is very good, very exciting. It's looking at the pathways for decarbonisation for 5 of Australia's biggest hard to abate sectors. But on my other podcast, First Fuel, we just dropped a interview with Rob Kelly from ClimateWorks and Troy Powell from Orica that really unpacked some of the key outcomes of that work that I know you, Tennant, were involved with as well.
I guess this is kind of self-dealing from me too. It's a very good report. I'm glad you spoke with them.
Hey, Luke.
Yeah.
Is this your favourite podcast? If you were to choose a favourite child, are we going to make you feel super awkward and make you choose?
Well, First Fuel is obviously my first child, and I remain devoted to it. But I must admit to being very excited by our shiny new podcast and greatly enjoy hanging out with both you lovely people every couple of weeks.
We'll take it.
But first fuel continues to be a lot of fun, and this episode in particular is great. Rob and Troy have deep expertise in this space. Hard-to-wait sectors, industrial decarbonisation, Troy specifically on the pathway for our chemicals industries. It's a great report, and it's a good way of finding out about it, so I commend that episode to you. All right, that is our show for today. We're all on Twitter. Frankie is at
Frankie Muscovich.
Tennant is at
Tennant Reid.
And my handle is at Luke Menzel. Tennant, we have an email address. What is it?
mailbag@letmesumup.net is the place to send all your hot tips on reports we ought to summarise and thoughts maybe on ones we did.
And Frankie, sometimes your show notes are so comprehensive, they won't fit in people's podcast players. And where should they go if they want to see the full glory of the Muscovich show note experience?
Ooh, sorry about that, guys. But if you're short of a bit of light reading, you can read those and find links to our glorious back catalogue of apps on letmesumup.net.
Fantastic. For Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.